I had identified so many problems around police investigating themselves. And it was really starting to not sit well with me, because I realized that the things that were happening at the other police service are also happening here. And I really started to feel like this was a systemic problem and it shouldn't exist, because, as you know, we have the Special Investigations Unit, and they would get involved if an allegation gets made about a police officer. In certain circumstances, they'll get involved. So if the allegation is a sexual assault, or if a police officer did something that resulted in a serious injury, then the SIU get involved and they investigate. And I just kept thinking, why would we not do the same thing with any criminal allegation against a police officer? Like, it didn't make sense to me.
Kwe Nindaluizi Pam Palmater, and I'm the host of this show, The Warrior Life. I'm a lawyer, professor, author, and activist from Eel River Bar First Nation, and my motto is education for action on Indigenous rights, social justice, and protecting the planet. On this podcast, you're going to get an education of a different kind, one that's enriched by the cultures, insights, and experiences of Indigenous activists, land defenders, and water protectors on the ground, as well as Indigenous artists, academics, and leaders of all kinds who are on the front lines of Indigenous resistance, resurgence, and revitalization. And today's podcast is going to be an eye-opening one for sure, so stay tuned. Welcome back to the Warrior Life podcast. My name is Pam Palmater, and I'm going to be your host. Back in the fall of 2023, I had the pleasure of talking to Kelly Donovan. Kelly's a former police officer and a whistleblower who works tirelessly for accountability in policing to end internal corruption. She's the author of 2 books, Police Line Do Not Cross, which has over 400 pages of stories that detail some shocking truth about policing in Canada. Her other book, Systemic Misfeasance in Ontario Policing and the Coordinated Suppression of Whistleblowers, has also been really popular for its honest and direct truth. She also has a podcast called Public Enemy Number 1, The Police Whistleblower, which is now in its 2nd season, and it's really addictive. You don't want to miss it. And with all the work that I've been doing over the last 20 years on police criminality and corruption, I knew I had to talk to her, especially since, as an Indigenous woman, her experiences of being silenced are all too common. On my other podcast, Criminals on Patrol, which is dedicated to exposing the dark side of the thin blue line of policing, you're going to hear short clips of Kelly as an expert on all of these issues. However, I knew that all of you Warrior Life fans would want to hear the entire interview. So here it is in full. Hi, Kelly. Thanks again for agreeing to come on my podcast and helping educate our listeners about what's happening. I have been following you for such a long time. Like I told you before this interview even started, I'm a huge fan of yours. I look up to you and the strength that you show. I know it's an unfair burden, but you seem to just be pursuing, despite all of the retaliation, all of the things that are happening to you. You're really on this whistleblower's journey, and I know that it's got to be stressful and it's got to take up a lot of time, and you probably have a million people asking you questions. So I appreciate the extended time you're taking to be on this podcast and help our listeners. Thank you so much, Kelly.
Oh, Pam, you have no idea how much of an honor it is to be asked to do your show, period. I'm very honored to be here.
I always love to hear that. Kelly Donovan is joining us, and she's going to talk to us. Now, Kelly, before we get started, I always give people an opportunity to introduce themselves, what nation they're from, just so that we can get a sense of who you are.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Brantford, Ontario. I'm a Mohawk of the Akwesasnes. And I went to university at University of Western Ontario, and I kind of bounced around a little bit between, different jobs and trying to figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. But I ended up getting into policing later in life, so I didn't even become a police officer until about 2010. So I've lived quite a few different lifetimes in my 44 years on this earth, but I know we're going to dig into my time as a police officer in the
Yeah.
podcast.
Okay. So let's start with something light. Pre-policing. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your journey. Were you a tap dancer? Did you go to university? Are you always wanted to be a singer? Like, what's a little bit about your journey pre-policing?
Well, I was actually a tap dancer, so now I'm wondering how much do you know about me? No, growing up, I was started off as like a competitive dancer. So my sisters and I did competitive dance for about 13, 14 years, and then I got turned on to rugby. So at one point, it was like my mom would pick us up from a rugby game. We'd be covered in mud, like we'd have mud all over our legs, and she'd have a bucket of soapy water with a face cloth because we'd have to clean all the mud off our legs because we had a dance competition, and then we had to put our tights on. So it was kind of like those transitions where we decided, like, I think I have to choose. I can't really do both anymore. And I fell in love with rugby. So that's actually where I met Layla Stats, as we both played for the Brantford Harlequins, rugby. But then when I went to university, I was able to play rugby at university too. So it was really a big passion of mine. That was pretty much what took over my life at about the age of 14.
Well, that's a hoot. The fact that you met Layla Stutz, because I love her. She's been on my podcast. Her brother's been on my podcast. Like, I'm just a huge fan of the work they do, and they manage to still find time for activism, kind of like you, like the work you do, but you make sure that you're advancing rights. So I think you told me before you went to university, and what did you take in university?
I ended up with a Bachelor of Science in Statistics, but that wasn't, when I went to school, I went there thinking that I liked mathematics, and I was good at math, and I thought I'll just go to university for math. But then you get there and you realize you don't just take math at university, like unless you're going to be a professor. But I kind of bounced around between different programs and ended up with a degree in stats. But never wanted to be a statistician or anything. I was really good with numbers growing up.
Well, that's a hoot because I hate math, but I kind of did the same thing as you. So like my family hadn't gone to university before, so I was like the first in my family to get like all of these university degrees. So when I was doing my undergrad, I thought, well, I don't know. What do you take in university? I didn't know about programs or streams or minors or anything like that. So all I did was sign up for courses that I took in high school. So I took
Yeah.
English, I took French, I took math, I took, all these like history, all of these other things. And then I just assumed that in your next year, you have to take the harder version and the harder version. So in second year, when I was taking calculus and then symbolic logic and set theory, I was like, well, first of all, I've never even heard of symbolic logic and set theory. I had no idea what they're talking about. It was the most confusing thing ever. And so
Yeah.
thank goodness I found someone who said, you can like pick a stream. You can be like a history major or go into native studies or you don't have to take all of these increasingly difficult math things because I have a cap on my math. Like there's only so much I can do of math, and then that's it. So isn't that funny? Like you're the
Yeah.
mathematician, and I'm the can't be a mathematician.
Well, it was funny because it was pretty much the same with me. Like my sisters and I were the same ones in our, the first generation in our family to go to university. So the whole time I kept thinking, like, all I need to do is just go, right? Like I just need to go there. As long as I go and I get a degree, that's all I need, right? So, I never really thought about what am I going to do with this degree after. I just wanted to get it. And, that was the big accomplishment, was just having it. But then didn't really know what to do with it after that. So I went into finance after that. I did this Canadian securities course, and I was living in Toronto and thought about, working on Bay Street and getting a job at the stock exchange. And, that was kind of the path I was on. But then, my mom got sick with cancer, and that was when I
Oh,
moved back to my hometown. And that's when, everything went off the rails. I got totally put on a different path, but that's
well,
where I had been.
I'm sorry to hear that. It's one of those things where people think they're on a certain path, and then life happens, and you end up like in a totally different place than you thought you were
Yeah,
going to be.
for
Um,
sure.
so So what happened after that? Like, were you working in finance or anything before you went to policing?
Yeah, so I had gotten a job at the bank, and I was working as like a personal banker, business banker, and this was kind of what got me into policing was because my partner at the time, him and I had 3 children. It was a relationship that kind of evolved right after my mother passed away. So it all happened, when you talk about life getting sent on a different path, all of this happened so quickly. Like my mom passed, and then I found out I was pregnant, and then it was kind of like, well, I guess I'm going to start a family. Like it didn't have a whole lot of time to digest anything that was happening. But fast forward, 5, 6 years, him and I were in a relationship. He was a police officer at the time. So this was while I was a banker. And that was my first experience with policing was with him and seeing what he did at work and things that were happening. But our relationship turned, it got to the point where it was becoming abusive, and I guess I knew in my heart that the relationship was over, but it was a matter of like, how this is going to end, what that's going to look like. But then things got to the point where we had to involve the police. So police were involved in our relationship, in conducting investigations. But as things went on through that process, I couldn't believe the way they were able to investigate themselves. So that was my first exposure to police, was watching them investigate one of their own people. When an allegation gets made that's domestic in nature, they get involved and then they can really decide what they want to do. So if it's somebody that he works with, it's his colleagues looking at him and trying to investigate him objectively and impartially. Like that's when I really learned that it really isn't possible. Police cannot investigate themselves independently or impartially. So we had a couple of incidents where police were technically involved, but the end result was that nothing happened with anything. We then had to go through the whole family court process, and anyone that's been through it, I was accused of lying, I was accused of making it all up. I just wanted to ruin his reputation. It really was an eye-opening experience for me. But the end of the day, when I thought like, this is wrong, it shouldn't be like this, because I also knew about our mandatory charge policy in Canada. And I knew, I had been reading the news enough to know why we had this mandatory charge policy. It was to protect victims and families. And we had that incident in Brantford. I don't know if you know about the Osadak murder, but it was, a woman who didn't want her son to visit with his father unsupervised because of a history of abuse. The courts didn't listen to her. The father was allowed unsupervised visits, and in the end he ended up murdering his son. So that was one of the major cases that said we need a mandatory charge policy in Canada, because we can't give the victim the ability to choose when to or when not to press charges, because then you have the retaliation of the accused when they complete their sentence, getting out and wanting to get revenge against the person that put them there. So I understood why we had it, but I didn't understand why when it came to a police officer it wasn't the same thing. So after that whole experience, that's what made me think like we need to have more people in policing that are like me, where even if it was a colleague, I could still look at them independently and impartially. And if they did something wrong, I'd have no problem holding them accountable. Like so in the whole interview process, so it was after my relationship broke down that, not only did I know that I needed a better career to support my kids as a single mother of 3 kids, but I just knew that I was well suited for the career and had the integrity to do it. So I started the application process, and it was in December of 2010 that Waterloo Region hired me, and I began my career as a police constable.
Wow. Wow. Like, I think of so many steps along the way where I am so surprised that you went into policing. So, first of all, you're married to a police officer, and you think, okay, that's cool. Like, I can see why maybe you'd want to be a police officer if your partner's like, hey, this is an awesome job. But then to have gone through all of that with your ex who was a police officer, and then to go through all of that with the police officers who were investigating, and it's like, I think I would have just been turned off of policing, but instead, you, like so many other women police officers that I've talked to, are like, I went into policing because I wanted to make it better. I wanted to make a change. I wanted women to see me there. I wanted to, you know, really advance ethics. And, if it's bad, it's bad. I'm going to call it. And if it's good, it's good. I'm going to support it. And so I just feel like police forces are so lucky that despite all of these experiences, you wanted to be a police officer to help make it better. So you ended up applying, and obviously you got accepted, and it was into Waterloo, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny to hear you say, that they're lucky to get these women applying, because you're absolutely right, they are. It's just unbelievable how little they appreciate that same woman that comes in, right? I mean, they want them, and they understand the value in having them, and I'm saying them very generally, because what I'm saying is, that whole diversity of thought, like bringing somebody in that has a new perspective. Let's bring that in. We appreciate that. But then once that person's there, then they want you to conform, right? So they like that, they can attract diverse applicants, but then once you're there, it's like, this is the box you need to fit into. And when you try to fit yourself in the box, but you say, well, I need a bit more room here, I'm not comfortable with this, and I want this to change, then, it's pretty much conform or get out. And a lot of women do leave prematurely. That, very few women actually make it through to retirement, because at a certain point in your career, you have to make a decision. Are you going to stay and sacrifice your own morals and ethics, or are you going to leave? And a lot of women do leave. And I mean, I'm at the point now where I would openly say to, a female applicant, like, it's not worth it. It is not worth it to apply. And if these police services across Canada are going to keep trying to recruit women, then they're going to have to start to answer to people like me, because I will continue to spread the message. Don't do it. I think that's the only way we're going to get them to listen, because right now you have women like me that are screaming at the top of our lungs about what could change to make things better, and they're just not listening to us. So early on, I mean, early on in my career, I hadn't been faced with that decision yet. So I was loving my job. I absolutely was loving it, because beyond training, you're totally autonomous. You're out in the cruiser on your own, one person in a car, you know. So every call that you go to, you get to handle it the way you think it should be handled, right? So someone like myself could go and do an investigation the way I think it should be done. I don't really have anybody influencing that. But then, as my career went on, I was promoted to be a use of force instructor. So then I was working on a team of other instructors and working at headquarters. And that was where things really changed for me, because I wasn't just alone in my car anymore. I was at headquarters, seeing the way senior leadership did business, and, overhearing conversations, and just really getting a look, behind the curtain, so to speak, on how things are done behind the scenes. And that's when I really started to take issue with the way a lot of things were being done.
Wow. Uh, I feel like there is a broken record of what happens. They're desperate to hire women, and of course, like Indigenous peoples and Black people from the Black community and so on and so forth. But then when you get there, it's like, okay, that's great. Now we have you in name only, but you still must fit inside this box and do everything basically status quo, like a little bit of tinkering around the edges maybe, but basically status quo. And then when people speak out about it, they're like, what? Oh, she's just not a team player, or all of the things that they say about them. So I don't know how much you're allowed to talk about or that you want to talk about, but can you talk a little bit about how it was different at headquarters, like different, and in what ways? Because I honestly think our younger generation needs to know this about
Oh yeah.
policing. So not to say uh so that they can a not suffer the harms that you've and other have had, or b that they are advocating for some kind of change that's actually substantive, not
Yeah.
just tinkering around the edges.
Yeah, for sure. Like, so for me, it was the fact that, because I chose to get into policing, it was basically on the premise of no individual is above the law, right? So what I saw was, when police investigate themselves, sometimes that police officer is above the law. The law doesn't apply to them. And I, so I came into the job knowing that I would probably encounter a little bit of that, but I wasn't going to sacrifice who I was to do the job. And I should tell you as well, during the interview process, I mean, they could pull up all the incidents I was involved in. I knew that they had access to all of that. So in the interview process, I was talking about the incidents that happened and what I learned from them, and how I didn't think the police service was investigating their own people properly. So they already knew that about me. But then, 5 years into my career, I started to see the investigations we were doing on our own members at Waterloo. So there had been there were two cases that were pretty public, but I also knew about two cases that weren't public. So I had known about four cases involving police officers where we did the investigation ourselves. So, our internal affairs or, whatever detectives were assigned to it, they were people of our own service investigating our own members. And they were all four of these cases were domestic in nature, but they were all handled so differently. So, I mean, in some cases, I'm not saying that the officers shouldn't have been arrested, but then there would be another case where the allegations were actually worse and that officer wasn't arrested. Or there were times where they would choose not even to investigate a member. So I knew about four incidents where it was so inconsistent. And, again, I was just upset with the inconsistency. It wasn't necessarily that they handled one or two of them correct or incorrect. It was that they should be consistent across the board. If we had a policy about internal investigations, it should be followed. But then I learned that we don't even have a policy. And they were appointing investigators to do investigations that might have actually been in a conflict of interest, but we never even defined what that means to be in a conflict of interest when it comes to an investigation. I had identified so many problems around police investigating themselves, and it was really starting to not sit well with me because I realized that the things that were happening at the other police service are also happening here. And I really started to feel like this was a systemic problem and it shouldn't exist because, as we have the special investigations unit, and they would get involved if an allegation gets made about a police officer. In certain circumstances, they'll get involved. So if the allegation is a sexual assault, or if a police officer did something that resulted in a serious injury, then the SIU get involved and they investigate. And I just kept thinking, why would we not do the same thing with any criminal allegation against a police officer? Like, it didn't make sense to me. So I started kind of, putting out some feelers. I talked to people that I worked with, some senior people, saying, why am I the only one that is uncomfortable about this? Like, why am I the only one that thinks this should change? And I even spoke out at my association and said, like, I have a real problem with the way this service investigates their own people, but why am I surrounded by people that don't seem to care? Like, I've only been here 5 years, but you guys have all been here way longer than me and everybody's just okay with it. But everywhere I went, everyone's answer was just, it's always been this way and it's never going to change. Like, people were saying to me, like, who do you think you are if you think you can change this? And I just, having been the victim that wanted to see something happen, coming forward and trying to get help from my local police service and being denied simply because the person I accused was a police officer, I really had a problem with this. And, there was nowhere I could go because our provincial oversight bodies would only accept complaints from the public. I was not considered a member of the public. And, there was really nowhere I could go. So the end of the day, the only thing I could come up with was going right to my police service board and presenting to them what I knew and basically holding them accountable to hold the police service accountable because that's their role. So that's what I decided to do in 2016. And that's what started all of this, was going to the police service board. I registered as a delegate, which, any person is allowed to do. I booked the day off work. So I considered myself a civilian pretty much, coming in there and telling them I had a concern. But I went in there and I sat at the board table and I was given 10 minutes to speak, and I got through as much of my material as I could. And I just pretty much told them that, I knew enough coming into policing that this sort of thing happened, but now I knew it was happening at my service. And I gave them enough information to know that I knew some details about these four incidents and I knew that they were handled inconsistently. I pointed to the fact we didn't have policy. I think I identified a lot of issues that were matters of public interest that they needed to look into. And in doing so, it relieved a ton of stress for me because I was battling this like moral dilemma in my head, thinking like, I know it's wrong. My kids are growing up in a world where some people are going to be above the law and they just have to accept it, but I couldn't accept that. And I knew I needed to do something about it. So having done the delegation, I felt really good that I got it off my chest. I didn't know what would happen with it. I thought maybe the board will look into it. Maybe they won't, but now I felt like now they have an obligation to, because I voiced it at a public meeting and now people are going to hold them accountable for it. But instead of that happening, it was about a week later that I got called into internal affairs and they just started throwing paperwork at me. It was a directive that, the chief is not going to let you present to the board again without his permission. You're not allowed to train members anymore. You're relegated to administrative duties. And that meant that somebody had to come off the road to replace me. So that's one less officer on the road while I'm working on a desk. And eventually they put me on a strict no contact order. I wasn't even allowed to contact members of the board going forward. So the board oversees the police service and specifically the performance of the chief. But the way police services work is the chief's allowed to discipline me. So the chief himself put me on a no contact order with members of the board, just said you can't communicate with them anymore. So that, it was initial immediate whistleblower retaliation against me. But we don't have any laws that protect people like me in Ontario. So I had no choice but to just, I did everything I legally could. I filed a human rights complaint. I filed a workplace harassment complaint. I started writing politicians. I even reached out to the Ontario Ombudsman. Like over a period of about 14 months, I couldn't get help from anyone because it all comes down to the authority of the chief of police. And, they
Oh
have
my.
more authority than almost anyone involved in that whole process. We don't have adequate oversight. And it was during that time that Justice Tulloch was doing his independent police oversight review. So I made sure that I attended a public session. I got to meet Justice Tulloch and I told him my story. And he was really blown away because I don't think, because of the oath of secrecy within police services, this is why more people don't speak up. It's because the oath of secrecy gets abused. And police chiefs say, if you talk about anything that you know from policing, you're going to get charged for misconduct. But that's not what the oath of secrecy is supposed to do. The oath of secrecy protects the people that we're arresting or charging, right? I can't charge someone, then go tell their husband or wife that I charge them. That's the sort of thing we have to keep private. But it gets abused, and police chiefs will use it to conceal any internal misconduct. So in that case, as long as I stayed employed as a police officer, I was bound to this directive. I was relegated to administrative duties and I couldn't talk to any members of the board. So they had full control over what was going to happen from that point on. And that's why eventually I decided to resign, because I just knew that, everything that happened to me was so fundamentally and incredibly wrong. And I knew that in sharing my experience is going to be the only way that, a Canadian government understands the importance of whistleblower protection, because we're probably the last country in the world that, we don't have any, we have very, very inadequate whistleblower protections, but we have no blanket law that protects somebody like me. So if we're not going to protect the people that have the courage to speak up about what they see, then then we deserve to have internal corruption happening everywhere, because we just don't see value in it. So in my case, in particular, like I said, I did resign. I decided to resign in June of 2017. But like I said, I wasn't going to just walk away because I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. Like, it sounds so wrong to say I'm just going to give up 24 years remaining of my police career, with my salary, benefits, everything. So the trade-off was, I knew they wanted to get rid of me. And I said, well, you can get rid of me, but I'm going to maintain my ability to speak about this because it is important. And I do still feel that they're matters of public interest. So when I resigned, I was very public about my resignation, and I released this. I was calling it a paper, a research paper at the time, but I had been writing this, collective of all these cases across Canada where they had done the same thing to police officers. So, there were cases where police officers had reported excessive force by a colleague, but the person that actually got the brunt of the harassment and the alienation was the officer that reported it, not the one that, was kicking the guy in the head on the ground, things like that. I couldn't believe the stuff that I was finding across Canada, but I really knew that most Canadians don't understand what really goes on. They just see the headlines that, a cop did something wrong and got charged with misconduct. They don't understand that, maybe that's actually the guy that reported something even worse. And now he's getting, retaliated against, because that's what happens, right? They're allowed to pick and choose what they do internally. And that's what I wanted to expose with that paper, was that all these cases had existed already across Canada. I was just the newest of a collection of them. And I knew that when people see them all together, they're going to see that we have a real problem in policing in Canada. And I released that in 2017. There were some people saying, like, is this real? Like, it was almost phenomenal because no one talks about Canadian policing that way. You know, all we think about is, oh, the NYPD had corruption in the 70s. Like, people have no idea that it's still happening today and it's happening across Canada. And I tried to, in that book, I tried to, explain what I believe the issues were. So it was, too much autonomy given to a chief of police, not enough oversight. We have inadequate police service boards that aren't trained and, in most cases just don't have the guts to hold the chief of police accountable, but that's their job, right? So we have this entirely ineffective system of oversight for police. And part of the book was me recommending what needs to improve, and that was partly that we have better trained police service boards and people that are actually suited for those roles, like not just they're political appointments, they're handpicked, cherry picked people that they know they can manipulate and influence. And it really, there's a lot that has to change. But so 2017, when I resigned, it was my way of saying, this is what I've learned in my policing experience. This is what I know needs to change. And then I went on a campaign to get across Canada and advocate for whistleblower protections. So 2017, I kind of, when I left, I launched my business. But at the time, I really wanted to provide whistleblower programs to organizations because I really felt like, if the government's going to drag their heels in creating this law, why don't I just offer the service to those people who see value in it now? And that's what I wanted to do. But it was such a new concept that initially I was just doing a lot of like HR consulting. But I was going across Canada, speaking at conferences, sharing my experience. And every time people would hear what happened to me, they would right away just say, like, that's incredible. Like, how was your chief allowed to do all this? And why didn't anybody step in and help you? And I just kept talking because I knew people need to hear this. And then more people are going to join my fight to push for these protections to be put in place. And things were going along, and my health was improving. I was starting to enjoy my life post police, but then the retaliation didn't stop. So what they did was, about 6 months after I resigned, I didn't mention this yet, but there had been a class action lawsuit filed against Waterloo Region. It was a $167 million class action lawsuit for systemic gender discrimination, sexual harassment, and sexual assault. So it was filed on behalf of current and former female members. And it was, I'll be honest with you, it was the class action that allowed me to resign on my terms, because they had two choices. They could, agree to my terms, or I would have stayed employed and joined the class action. I was in a very unique position when I was negotiating my resignation. But 6 months after I resigned, the chief, Brian Larkin, was holding me out as a success story, to try to defend the class action and get it dismissed. So he was holding me out as, look at, we have female members who have made human rights complaints and we've settled their cases and they're happy, but that obviously that wasn't the case with me. That wasn't what had happened. So when I saw that in his affidavit in December of 2017, I thought, like, I left, I gave up my employment, but it's not ever going to end. Like, I think they're always going to come after me. And I might not be telling you exactly what I was alleging Brian Larkin did, but I felt like what he was doing was unlawful. And then a month later, in January, they filed to appeal my WSIB claim, because when I resigned, I had PTSD. They knew that I had been involved in a near fatal shooting accident when I was a police recruit. They knew that. It was all on my personnel file. But when I left, I was seeking psychology treatment, and my medication was being paid for by WSIB. So upon resignation, the only thing I wanted was to continue my medical care, because I had given up my benefits and everything else. But 7 months after my resignation, they appealed to remove my medical benefits. And that, to me, like, people talk about retaliation, but you have to understand, my chief is going on the news talking about how serious of a problem PTSD is for first responders, talking about how many officers were taking their lives as a result of the operational stress of policing. And then they try to get rid of the only care I'm getting for my PTSD. Like, that sent a pretty clear message to me that, like, not only do they want to continue to harass me and whatever else, but, like, that's how badly they wanted me to go away. They wanted my only source of care to be taken away from me. But that's really where, I started thinking, like, they're never going to let me go, are they? Like, they're never going to just let this be a clean break, like I thought it was, like I thought it would be. Because the resignation I negotiated, I thought protected me, right? I thought I was doing the right thing. I was leaving, but I was leaving on terms that were going to ensure that they wouldn't continue to harass me. I'd be able to recover with my health, and I'd be able to be a good mom to my 3 kids. But here we were, 7 months into my resignation, and I had to decide if I was going to try to hold them accountable for alleged breaches of my resignation agreement. But then I also kind of thought, well, I'd be kind of a fraud if I'm out there, preaching about accountability and policing, but I don't even have the guts to hold them accountable when they do something to me. So May of 2018 is when I filed a very simple lawsuit against them for breach of contract. And that's what started everything that is still going on today, because they don't like it when you try to hold them accountable. So I filed my lawsuit against them in May 2018. It was 51 days later, they filed a case against me at the Human Rights Tribunal. And they're alleging that every single time I open my mouth and talk about what happened to me, I'm breaching the resignation agreement. But since 2018, I've been filing proof that there is nothing in my resignation agreement that prevents me from speaking. But they've been allowed to keep it going for, we're in 5+ years now. So like, I can't even, that there's so many details involved in the case that, most of them are insignificant at this point. But the significant aspects of it are that, I had a case against them, they had a case against me, both cases proceeded. But as their case was proceeding against me, I mean, I kept saying to the Human Rights Tribunal, like, how can they even bring this case against me when I'm not prohibited from speaking? So I'm like anyone else in the community that decides to speak up about what they see in their like police service. I'm not bound by an oath of secrecy. I'm not bound by anything. How can they be trying to restrict my freedom of expression? And the tribunal didn't seem to entertain any of my communications. I would file these requests to dismiss their case. I wouldn't even get a response. And as time was going on, I kept thinking, like, why am I not being heard? And then I literally just was playing around with Google one day and throwing in some names. And I found out that the registrar of the HRTO had been the former general manager and chief instructor of the Ontario Police College. And, it just blew my mind. I was like, it's everywhere, right? This level of control is everywhere, because how am I going to be able to get the police services case dismissed when the guy who's deciding how to manage these cases came from the Ontario Police College? Like, it was like everywhere I turned, I was just up against more control by the police. And I was starting to just wonder, when is this going to end? So, that's basically what's been going on since 2018 until today, was my multiple attempts to hold them accountable through the civil court system. And my recent, I beat them once at the Court of Appeal in 2019. I represented myself and won, and had my lawsuit opened up again. And then they went back and revisited the motion that was overturned, and they got it reopened again. And then they dismissed my case again. And I lost the second time at the Court of Appeal. I mean, with everything I've been through in the past 5 years, I'm pretty much prepared now to become a lawyer at any point in time, because I've been there and done that with everything. And the Human Rights Tribunal has proceeded all the way along. So with that case, I mean, the recent decision was that they pretty much wanted to throw out my entire case. So I had to file for judicial review of that decision. But in my judicial review, I'm also trying to hold the Human Rights Tribunal accountable and say, you had a registrar appointed who was in a conflict of interest. And he's the guy that along the way was ignoring my submissions, not letting me be heard on the issue of dismissing their case. And now I'm asking divisional court to look at that issue and decide how the Human Rights Tribunal is operating, right? I mean, now I'm looking at bigger picture items. And like I said to you in, our private conversation, it's a bit of a social experiment, because now I'm thinking, to what lengths will all of these bodies go just to protect the reputation of the police institution? Because all I've been ever asking them to do is just to look at it objectively, impartially, and let's decide once and for all that nobody's above the law, that everybody should be held to the same standard. If anything, people like to say that police are held to a higher standard, but that's bullshit between you and I. Most people know that. But it's always just been that we have to have a standard that gets upheld everywhere. And if the Tribunals Ontario has rules about conflicts of interest, then Why does it take someone like me to point it out to them that he's in a conflict of interest? I mean, this is how pathetic it is. I mean, when I finally made the complaint that he was in a conflict of interest, my complaint wasn't entertained, but they moved this guy to another position, but you'll never guess where. They moved him to be the registrar of the Ontario Civilian Police Commission, the oversight body that oversees chiefs and board members. So, how is there no conflict in that role? I mean, there's got to be a better role for this guy, right? I just kept thinking, like, how do they have their own? They have this whole set of rules, but they don't even follow them themselves. Like, there's just been so many aspects of my case that I've uncovered that at every single point in time, something happens, and I say to myself, that's a matter of public interest. That's a matter of public interest. Like
Wow.
everywhere I go, these are all public interest matters because all these people are collectively trying to shut me up pretty much. And it's all being done on the public dime. But
Oh,
I always want to remind people, like, what is it they're trying to stop me from saying? Because
yeah.
all I'm saying, I'm talking about what they did to me, right? And if they don't like the way it
Wow.
sounds, then maybe they should start behaving better. And that's
Well,
what it all comes down to. We don't have oversight. If we did, then these people wouldn't conduct themselves the way they do.
you couldn't write a movie script as convoluted and with as many twists and turns. I mean, you would expect if you're gonna be someone who retaliates, like, you do one thing, but they must have spent in the range of hundreds of thousands of dollars on this case now. If I'm not wrong, I mean, I don't do litigation, but I'm aware of the cost. This must just be an ever increasing cost for them.
Oh yeah, I mean, and you know, you do know me well enough to know that I'm going to find that out. But I had along the way, someone had kind of tipped me off in 2019 that they had filed these requests and obtained the legal invoices. And at that point, like I think I had been I had been gone for about 2 years. It was about the summer of 2019, and they had then paid about 250,000 towards their lawyer. So at that point, it was pretty much the equivalent of keeping me on, right? It was pretty much the equivalent of my salary, my pension, my benefits that they had been paying to this lawyer. I was long gone, but they still were trying to come after me. And then I just kept, once I knew that, I thought, that's a good way to look at this. So as time went on, I just kept filing the requests. And every time we had a court appearance, I'd file another one. And the most up to date figure that I have is March of 2023. At that point, from the time I first spoke out, it was over $635,000 that they'd paid this lawyer. And that's partly the reason I'm so public is because, if they want to address the issue of me speaking, then I feel like then we should be going in front of a civil court judge and I get the chance to talk about being a matter of public interest. Because when that amount of money is being spent to a lawyer to persecute a former employee, like at what point is someone going to say, what is this all for? What's the end game? What do you hope to accomplish here? Because if it's just to shut me up, then at some point I should get to say, well, this is what I'm advocating for. These are matters of public interest. And what right do they have just to get me to stop talking about it? Like that's what it comes down to, right? Is if I wasn't gaining traction, if people weren't listening to me, there wouldn't be value in them coming after me. But that's why I really want people to understand what I'm telling you is so accurate and so important that they're willing to spend $1 million to try to shut me up. And that's partly why, because these aren't just little players in the game, right? We're talking about Waterloo Regional Police, and this entire time they've had a tremendous amount of influence over the rewrite of our policing legislation. In 2018, I went and spoke at the Ontario legislature, shared my story with them. That's also an allegation that I breached the resignation agreement, but I share my story as many ways as I can. But I shared my story, and even that wasn't enough for them to understand that police chiefs have too much power in the province of Ontario. And I can confidently say across the country, I'm not familiar with everyone's legislation, but I know that the culture is the same everywhere. But not only that, I mean, this whole time, my chief of police that was making all these decisions, he was the president of the Ontario Association Chiefs of Police. And during this whole ordeal, he became the president of the Canadian Association Chiefs of Police. So, you want to talk about somebody who's invincible in this country and above the law? Like, how can anyone hold someone in that position accountable? That's what I've been trying to do. And as much as they've wanted me to go away, I haven't. I've just kept persistently following through with, they put up a hoop, I jump through it. And I wouldn't have the energy to do this if I hadn't met my now husband along the way, because there clearly were times, this has been a very taxing journey for me. And there definitely were times that if I didn't have him in my life, like I just wouldn't have made it through. I would have given up. It would have been too much work. I would have mentally been drained, completely taxed. But he was there to pick me up and say, this is bigger than you. Like, you're fighting for more people than just yourself. And I get notes all the time from people that just say, like, I know that what I'm doing is history making, because
Yes.
most people like me, if I didn't have the ability to represent myself, there's absolutely no way I could have afforded a lawyer this whole time. Like, I get criticized a lot by people saying, like, why are you so stubborn? Why don't you just go and hire a lawyer? Like, well, who has $1 million laying around that they want to spend on a lawyer? And for what? Just to beat the police? Like, that's not what this is about. It's about trying to hold them accountable. And if I can show that this is what it takes, that's pretty pathetic, right? If we live in a country where it takes $1 million in legal fees to try to hold the police service accountable simply because no one wants to hear what I have to say, like, clearly our justice system is broken. If all I tried to do in 2018 was hold them accountable for simple breaches of my agreement, and this is what I've had to do to get there, and I've been having to entertain and defend myself against their case that doesn't have any legal basis to begin with. Like, the whole thing is so outrageous that I know that I can't give it up at this point. I have to see how far they're really willing to go. Like, I really want to know, is it $1 million? Is it more than that?
Yeah, and how many years and how many filings? I mean, honestly, every 5 minutes that you're speaking, I'm like, "Oh, wait, Ontario cheese, please? Canadian cheese?" Like, no, this can't be true. Like, it is so outrageously over the top on their part that I'm
Yeah.
like, half of this can't be true.
And,
25%, like,
yeah, people talk about how we should be naming names and things now. And I totally agree, because, the fact that someone like him can, he'll go to the International Association Chiefs of Police and represent Canada on the international stage. And, at the same time, there's people looking at my case internationally that are saying, how is that able to be, like, how is that happening? That's so wrong. And that sort of thing shouldn't happen. But nobody's connecting the dots that the people responsible for it are up at that level. Like, we don't have anybody in Canada with the courage to actually hold a chief of police accountable. Like, it's really scary, because you hear a lot of people say, policing is the biggest organized crime network in Canada. And then some people will laugh and say, like, oh, that's ridiculous, you're just a conspiracy theorist. Like, that's outrageous. But when you look at it, you think, well, if there was anyone who was above the law, who would it be? It would be the person that's in charge of it all. That they're the ones making all the decisions. Who makes the decisions about them? Like, because I went before a superior court judge, and all I asked was for them to make a decision about that one person, and they weren't willing to do that. So then where do you go? Who do you complain to when there's a police officer breaking the law? You can't go to the police. So, like, we don't have this superior body that is actually capable and willing to hold police accountable, and police at any level. Because clearly, without that, we're saying that police chiefs are above the law. I mean, in that recent rewrite of our legislation, what they came up with was, if there's a criminal allegation about a chief of police, we'll just appoint an unrelated chief of police to come in and investigate them. Like, there's no such thing. From the time, from the time they're elected as a chief of police, they're going to these, like,
wow.
weekend retreats at Deerhurst Resort. They're all schmoozing and golfing, and, like, it's a culture that is, like, it's funny, right? Because people that have been in there, they know, like, the culture of policing is, like, you're in or you're out, and you can't be in if you're willing to point the finger at another police officer. Like, that's the biggest no you can ever do, and as soon as you do that, you're out. So you look at these people that have been in the profession for 20, 30 years, that have made it up to those levels, and what it took to get there, and those are the people that we're putting in charge, right? Like, it blows my mind whenever I read, an appointment to government or something where I knew the person was a lifelong, a career cop. And you just think like there is 0% chance that that person did not encounter a moral dilemma and have to make the right choice to stay in the profession. There is zero chance that that happened because, I only made it to year 5 before I had my first moral dilemma. But guaranteed, you make it to 15, 20 years, you've seen some stuff along the way. And had you spoken out about it, you wouldn't be there still. So, it's very telling when you see those people that have been in the profession for a long time, but knowing what it's like on the inside and knowing how many people are still there that reach out to me and say, I'm supporting you quietly. Like, they're not willing to support me publicly because of what it would mean for their careers. But I just know that most people, I say most, but it's probably about 95% of people in policing know that what I'm telling you is true, want to
Mhm.
see a change for the better. And it's just that they're too afraid to do anything about it because of what will happen to them when they do speak up.
And like from someone, obviously, I'm not a police officer. I used to be a lawyer at Justice Canada and work with the RCMP. So that's a thing. But I've spent like the last 15 or more years just researching policing, like corruption in policing, like corruption, not like with the average person would think of as corruption, but corruption as in not reporting crimes, not coming forward when another police officer has done something wrong, covering
Yeah.
up crime, like and many of the things that you're talking about. So it's that kind of thing. And I didn't do the research with the view that every single police officer is the exact same. However, I knew based on the research, it is so widespread. Like a multitude of things are so widespread that in the old days, they used to talk about, oh, there's a few bad apples. Well, how many reports, inquiries, commissions, investigations of various police forces across Canada do you need in order for people to finally accept, well, you know what? Maybe it's a few good apples, because I'm sure you're aware that report by former Supreme Court of Canada Justice Bastrash, who was writing about what happened to women in the RCMP, like more than 3,000 women. And he
Yeah.
was like, the RCMP culture is toxic and it eats policy for breakfast. And
Yeah.
so everyone knew what was happening. The criminality, sexual assaults, harassment, discrimination happened at every level. Those guys got promoted. Now they're in control of the guys doing those same things. That it is impossible. Like, they won't fix themselves. I mean, this is coming from a Supreme Court of Canada justice. So for anyone in Canada who thinks it's like one or two whistleblowers just making up stuff, it is so widespread. And I can say that statistically, it is so widespread, which is why I do this research, because there are many women who tried to do what you were doing. And sadly, they're not here to talk about it because
Right.
they just couldn't take it anymore. And that's what gets me.
Yeah.
Who would be on a fictional vendetta that would end up destroying their lives and their marriages and their mental health and physical health, such that they take their own lives, if they were just making it up? Like,
Yeah.
it is such a profound problem. And for you to be so honest about it, knowing the pushback that you get, and that the police play to the end, like they will litigate until the very end. They just don't stop. I mean, at
Yeah.
what point does ministers of public safety, or maybe people who care about human rights, or somebody actually intervene and
Well,
say, we got a problem?
it's funny you mentioned the Minister of Public Safety, because look at Canada's Minister of Public Safety. Anyone who's read the G20 report, right? Justice Morden's report, like that report is full of instances where, as police chief, Bill Blair did not believe that he had an oversight body that he had to answer to. Time and time again throughout that report, it's him admitting he didn't give all the information to the board because he didn't feel he had to. Police chiefs in Canada have this superiority complex that they operate in a bubble, and they don't. And we have to have adequate oversight, and there has to be somebody monitoring their performance. But
Yes.
someone like him, we now have in that prestigious position, right, of public safety minister of Canada. And like, it's times like that that my mind is just like, ugh, because we're not learning from our mistakes, right? We're not looking, like you said, there's all these reports and they just get put on a shelf and we don't learn from them. But at some point, it's like, when are people going to realize that if we keep doing more of the same thing, we're going to get more of the same thing? We're not going to get these culture changes we want. We're not going to get the police services that we deserve and the public service that we actually pay for. You know, all these things that we do deserve better than what we're getting right now. And there's very few people that understand how toxic things really are. Like, you openly use the word corruption, and so do I. And when you use it, there's a lot of people that say, oh, corrupt, you know, you're just a conspiracy theorist, you know, you're off the edge. But they don't understand that corruption is nepotism, cronyism. Like you said, it's neglect of duty, it's like selective enforcement. Like, that's
Yes.
all corruption, because we have a law for a reason. And when these police officers swear their oath of office, they're saying, regardless, I will enforce the laws impartially, objectively, and according to law. But the first time that somebody ventures off that track, we're not even allowed to talk about it, right? Like, as a police officer, you're not even allowed to point it out, because then you're the one that gets ousted out of the profession. So police officers are taught very early on, you know, don't, like, I wrote about this in my book, I call it the oath of unconsciousness. You're not swearing an oath of office, you're swearing an oath of unconsciousness. And you're saying, you know, I will do my job according to law and how you want me to do it, but I understand that at a certain point, I'm going to have to be unconscious to some of the things I see, because I can't enforce the law if it goes against what my chief wants me to do. Because if I do, I'm going to be the one that has to leave the profession, you know, to a certain extent. And someone like me wasn't able to be unconscious. Like, I wasn't young and naive, right? I had already lived a couple lives, I'd had a couple jobs, professions, I had 3 kids at home. So when I saw those things happening, I wasn't able to just like shove them down in my gut and ignore the feelings I was having and just go on and do my job. I wasn't able to do that. And they're going to encounter more and more people like me. And like you said, that should be a good thing, right? Police should be welcoming these people that have
Yes.
strong morals and strong ethics, because those are going to be the leaders of tomorrow that are actually going to affect change. But instead, we're letting them be eliminated. Everybody is sitting by and watching it, and nobody is
Yeah.
saying a goddamn thing, right? Like, it's embarrassing to be a Canadian today and see the state of affairs, you know, across the board. And having children, like, if I didn't have children, I might not care. But having children, I keep thinking, like, what is the world that we're leaving for them? What is it going to be like? You know, they better get in tight with a police chief. You know, they better make some friends in government, because they're going to need a favor sometime, and that's how it's going to happen, right? Like, we don't even have a sense of law anymore. It's pretty much just make sure you have good friends in high places and you'll be okay, which is pathetic. You know, we live in Canada, we don't live in some third world country.
And the fact is that it's true. So, for any of the listeners, however you're listening to this, wherever you're watching this, I I can vouch for I'm a lawyer. I've been a practicing lawyer for almost 25 years. I have been doing extensive research on policing, because corruption in policing is actually a threat to public safety and national security. So that's why I do all that research. It's not because, oh, I knew a police officer one day and he was an asshole, and so now I've got a vendetta. I don't work in policing. That's why I do this stuff. And at every stage that, like Kelly is telling you, there is a problem and there is corruption and there is significant conflict. You know, I'll add to that the research I did on uh, police oversight boards and police oversight, like they're called different things in different areas, just call them police oversight bodies, and how the statistics show that the majority of them are filled by former cops, many of whom are still contracting with the local police force, or they're the trainers of the new generation of police. And I'm like, how do you expect, like, police investigating police? I think most Canadians are like, wait a second. And then if your oversight is former police officers, almost all white men, it compounds and just gets worse and worse. And then I can't help but go back to that report, Broken Dreams, by that former Supreme Court of Canada justice, who's like, said exactly what you said, that there's a path. And in order to stay in policing, you have to overlook all of the law, overlook what you know is happening, and sometimes be a part of it or know it's happening and cover it up to get to be a police officer for 30 years. No one goes through policing and's like, wow, I've never seen anything happen, and be able to say that honestly. And so he was saying how police face this dilemma, especially women and Indigenous peoples and people with racialized backgrounds, that they have a choice to make. Are they going to conform to this and then be part of the abuse and corruption and criminality? Or are they
Yeah.
going to stand up? They stand up and they're out, or they resign and they're out, or because of, mental health and other issues, they can't possibly be in. So you've got all these former police officers who are doing their darndest to try to make things right. And so you hear society say, defund the police. We've got to address all of this criminality and corruption and racism and abuse. And then you've got the other side saying, that's just an exaggeration, few bad apples. But I have yet to meet a police officer from any force, and I've been doing this research for 15 years, that hasn't said off the record, oh my gosh, you don't even know how bad it is. But like, you don't even know, here's what I've seen. Here's what I've done. Like, here's
Yeah.
like every single one. There's never been one who said, I've been in policing 30 years and I've never seen anything immoral, unethical, criminal, corrupt, abusive. Like, that's a
Right.
reality. And
Yeah. And that,
I know this, but Kelly, this must have impacted you. It must
oh, yeah.
keep impacting you.
Yeah. And I mean, I can't even really articulate how much it's affected me and impacted me. I mean, without saying too much, I think there will come a time in 2024 that I get to make it like, very publicly explain what this has done to me. But for now, I mean, I've also been in a tight spot because I've been trying to promote my business and start a career and try to earn a living, right? So I've been out there operating my business and getting into the public eye for that. And I've had to, be professional, look professional, act professional. A lot of times that has meant literally compartmentalizing my life, right? I have this box on the shelf over here that's my litigation, and when I have to take that box down and prepare for court or write my submissions, I go through it all again. I get all the physiological responses to all the stress, and then I have to package it back up, put it back on the shelf, and take down this self-employed box, and dress up nice and do my hair pretty. And it's been really, really hard to do that for the past 5-6 years, and I never imagined I'd have to do that this long. But as anybody knows, like the mental and physical toll that this stuff takes on you is immeasurable. But if not me, then who, right? Like there's so many, like John Lewis was one of my mentors before he passed away, but all of his quotes were just like, if not you, then who? Like someone has to do this. And I look around and I don't see anybody else, a lot of people telling me that what I'm saying is true, but none of them have the courage to speak up about it. And I feel like I am in a good position to do it. And I am a fighter. I've always been a fighter. And, they cannot deny me my existence. So just my mere existence, having been through this experience, is enough, in my opinion, to force change. Because just like you've said, like when you hear everything and you look at everything I've been through, it's like, how has this happened right under the public's eye? Almost as if nobody's been paying attention. Like, how did we get to this point? How did they get to $635,000 without anybody noticing? Because Waterloo Region keeps negotiating, every time the police want more money, it goes to the region of Waterloo, and they always say, well, why do you need more money? Why do you need more money? And I'm screaming in the background, like, they need more money for their lawyer. Why isn't anybody listening? And nobody does, right? I just keep thinking, at what point is this house of cards going to crumble? And I really hope that when it does, I'm still standing strong, because I'll be ready to explain to them how we got here. I'll be ready to explain how they could prevent this from happening again. But it is going to take some robust whistleblower protection laws to be put in place, because that's what we see happening in BC. This class action filed on behalf of the municipal police service, the police women, police officers. I don't know if you heard about that, but it's pretty much them saying, we're going to try to take control of this matter on our own. Because when you work in a municipal police service, you don't get any of the protections that we have federally or provincially. So Canada wants to say we have whistleblower laws and we'll protect victims of abuse and harassment, but they only extend to federal and provincial workplaces, right? So you look at how many police officers in Canada are municipal police service or police officers, we don't have any of that protection. And unless the government wants to just keep seeing class action lawsuits being filed across the country, somebody at that level needs to perk up and realize that there needs to be something in place to protect these people, because right now you're telling us that we should report the abuses that we're suffering from, and then we do, and you let the abuser continue to abuse us. Like, the whole system is broken, and at some point someone needs to listen to how it could be fixed, because there's a lot of people willing to talk, but my energy is running thin, and there's going to come a time where I just don't want to give them the time of day. But they can't say I haven't given them enough chances, right? I've been willing to talk with people at that level since 2017, and it's just I have had some appointments with politicians over the years, but it doesn't seem like anybody's listening.
Yeah, politicians don't seem to really like talking about problems in policing. And I think they got a little taste of that when the Freedom Convoy went to Ottawa and all the politicians were like, hey, why aren't the police doing anything? Why aren't they helping? And it was a big deal. And I'm just, throwing that out there. But I look at the RCMP and their massive class action suit where like more than 3,000 women, some were violently sexually assaulted by their male coworkers. So at the end of the day, there's a class action. It's settled. Some of the women get some payments, never enough for what they went through. But I'm
Right.
like, okay, where's all the criminal convictions? Like, I want to
Yes.
see all of the criminal convictions. I want to see all those predators out of policing, because why would I join the RCMP? Why would anyone join the RCMP if they're still there? Right? Like,
Yeah.
nothing has changed. And then I think, gosh, then you've got all of these problematic oversight, and then you have all of these bodies that simply aren't getting it done, and it leaves you to you. And so one of the things I've seen you do is you've got a book called Police Line, Do Not Cross, Silencing a Canadian Police Whistleblower. And I believe this is the third edition because, people talk about their lives and they write a book and something's happened. Well, for you, it just never stops. So it's like, okay, well, here's the first edition. Well, it just keeps going on. So I'm going to have a second edition. Well, it's still going on. So I'm going to have a third edition. Can you tell us a little bit about what people can expect to find in this book?
Yeah, and I'm also not sure where it ends, because I keep thinking even now I could write another edition. Like, I have to stop at some point. But I just, my first book I put out in 2017 was my report that I released, and it's still very educational. I still grab it today when I want to find some information, because it's very information heavy, and I cite all my sources. But it's not really about my story. I only cover my story in about one paragraph of that book. So I started thinking, I have to share my story in the form of a book, because then I can go into all the detail about stuff that, I can't really talk about publicly, because, as you said, this podcast could be 5 hours long if we talked about everything. So the book kind of takes you through, everything, why I got into policing, what I experienced when I started in policing, and then when I started to see that things were being done, in my opinion, wrong, or could be done better. But I take people through, exactly what I knew. I don't expose any names, but I talk about the evidence I saw. I need people to kind of put themselves in my shoes, see what I knew, and maybe come to the realization that they're just like me. I mean, we're all the same that way. We see something that's wrong, and then we see that it's fundamentally wrong, and we want to do something about it. And then the book just takes you through what happened, what I did, what happened as a result, as the litigation went along, who was involved, and how things got side railed, and just, the cost of, what they were spending as things went along. And I also touch on, because we talked about this, like some of the political appointments that get made to certain oversight bodies, and how that impedes our ability to have adequate oversight of police. So it's really an educational book and an eye opener for a lot of people. But I do feel like if you're going to be a taxpayer in this country, and you will support institutions like policing, and it's not only that, right? I mean, people have to understand that police are the only people in Canada that can deprive you of your constitutional rights legally, right? They're the only people that can actually put handcuffs on you and put you behind bars, and, take your life. Like, they're the only ones that can legally and lawfully take your life. So if we just keep sitting by and not paying attention to what's happening in policing, like, there is a lot at stake, right? This isn't just a matter of trying to, keep an eye on what these people are doing. Like, they have control over our lives, and we have to start paying attention to how that control is being used, or in some cases misused. So the book is really to share my story, but I'm just, I'm almost a nameless whistleblower, because the same thing that happened to me could happen to anyone, because the government hasn't listened to put protections in place for people like me. So, I'm working on the audiobook right now, because it's a big book. I think I'm up to 400 pages now. I do want to get the audiobook released so that people can listen as opposed to have to get through it. But I do think it's a good starting point if people are really not familiar with what's happened up until now in policing, and really how bad things are. Like you said, it's not just a couple bad apples.
So people can get this book, Police Line Do Not Cross, Silencing a Canadian Police Whistleblower, either on your website or on Amazon, for example. And I see something else on your website, and it's called The Systemic Misfeasance in Ontario Policing and the Coordinated Suppression of Whistleblowers. Is that the report you were talking about that's available? Because
Yeah.
this says it's available as an ebook.
Yep. That was the report I sent to government in 2017. But then I had a lot of people tell me, like, there's a lot of good information here. You should sell this as a book. So I just put it into a smaller format and started offering it for sale. And that's an audiobook as well. And I have that up on Audible right now. So I did take the time to record that one as an audiobook. But I think the paper copy is the way to go, because there's so many citations. I was really concerned about citing all of my sources of information. So if you have the paper copy, you can see every one of my sources, look them up, do your own research. But it definitely, I laugh now because I wrote that in 2017, but I was writing about how all of these oversight bodies, and even the Human Rights Tribunal, and all these places that are supposed to be overseeing police and offering help to victims, they all coordinate their efforts to make sure that that person is never heard, right? And then here I am 6 years later, and it's like, damn, I wrote the playbook for them. That all they had to do was read my book, and then they knew how to keep me silent, because everything that's happened to me is like pretty much what I wrote about. I wrote about how, like, we make these political appointments just to make sure that status quo will keep going. Like, and here I am 7 years later, that's exactly what's happened. So it's still a good starting point. And like I said, I do reference it quite often, because I'll think to myself, I think that happened to a police officer in Thunder Bay, and I'll grab the book and I'll go to the index and look Thunder Bay and then find the page. And I'm like, yeah, I knew it. In 2010, there was a case just like that, and they're all there. So, if anyone were to say to me, like, oh, because I still have people say, well, what happened to you is pretty unique. That's not happening across the board. That's just you. But then you look at that book, and I have cases all the way across Canada. Like, the one I like to talk about is Perry Dunlop from Cornwall. He was a police officer working for the Cornwall Police Service. And are you familiar with the Cornwall inquiry and everything that happened there?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He was the officer that brought any of it to light, because the whole thing had been concealed. Like, these legal agreements were being written, victims were being paid off, and they were told to go away. But Perry was the one that thought, these are children being abused. Why is this not being reported to the child welfare agencies? And he was the one that made the report that kind of blew the lid off what was happening. And you would think that he would be somewhat of a hero in that situation, but he faced decades of torment and harassment. At one point he spent 30 days in jail. And this was because he did what he thought was the right thing to do, and reported abuse of children to the child welfare agency. Like, when you read about these cases, it's like, it's unbelievable that this has been happening in Canada, but no one really knows about it, or they don't know the scale and really how
Mm-hmm.
prevalent it has been across the country.
Yeah, I think you really hit on it there. Um, unless we expect Canadians to be independent researchers and research every issue that they hear about in the media, I think it's unfair that Canadians will hear like one issue about a police officer in the Maritimes. And then, they might hear something about a police officer in BC. So it gives you this false sense that, well, of course, there's going to be one or two bad things that happen, but it's not the system. Uh, you would really require, it really requires that it be all in one place. It's kind of like any report that's being done. It's not just this one case. Look at all the other cases, and then people understand the extent of it. And so I appreciate that you have this website too that helps. It's called policeversuswhistleblower.ca. And I'll post the links in the description box for the video and the podcast. And you can go there and it's got all the information about legal proceedings. Like, oh my gosh, you've got 2016, 17, 18, 19, like the dates just keep going. You've got, about it. There's a place where you can get these books. But the other thing, in addition to your two books that we just talked about, is you also have a phenomenal podcast, like phenomenal. I was addicted listening to it because the amount of credibility and the purpose, the reason why you're doing this, it speaks to me because I've cared very much about police reform. So there's this podcast, for anyone who hasn't heard it yet. It's called Public Enemy Number One. And I think here in Ontario, that might be Kelly Donovan. I'm not sure, but it's called Public Enemy Number One, the Police Whistleblower Podcast. And you get to hear her story, like in a much deeper way than we can do in, say, like a 1 hour podcast, for example. I think everybody should listen to it. Now, Kelly, what made you think to do a podcast? So you're doing all of these legal proceedings, you're trying to meet with politicians, you're doing, they say, oh, you must do this, this, and this. You're trying to tick all of the boxes of everything that you're supposed to do. You've got a website, you write this report, you have a book, and now you have a podcast. What inspired you to take on the additional burden of a podcast?
Well, it's really like with everything having gone on so long and everything being so convoluted. I mean, I got to the point where I really felt like they had the upper hand here. Like they've been able to control the narrative, and they, at a certain point, I felt like they have successfully turned the tables on me, and now everybody thinks that I've done something wrong, and it's total villain. Like I've become the villain in the situation, right? Because nobody really, people stopped paying attention to my case because it went on for so long. People thought, well, she must have done something wrong. Like clearly this wouldn't still be going on. A police service would not be able to go after her for 5 years if there were no grounds to their case. So I just knew, like, I need to explain what's going on here. Like there's a level of education, basic information about policing that the general public don't know. So, I knew, and I really had no idea how it was going to turn out because I didn't plan it. I didn't script anything. I sat down with my actual website in front of me so I could go through every year of legal decisions and submissions and know that I was saying everything in the right order. But I just started off, and I'd have these little sidebar conversations where I'd say, a lot of people don't know that the police service board is legislated to oversee the conduct of the police chief, but yet the information that gets disclosed from the police chief or police service to the board is all filtered through the chief. So imagine having a job that you get to decide what information your boss knows, right? So imagine having a job where your boss is only going to know information that you tell them. And that boss is going to decide if you get your contract renewed and if you get a salary increase. So you get to decide what information you're going to share with them. You're obviously only going to share the stuff that is, positive, and the stuff that doesn't look good on you, you're going to keep that down here. You're just going to show them all the really good things. And that's the way our laws are written, right? So it gave me the chance to explain things in common terms so people can understand easily just really what we have going on here, and how it applied to my story as I went along. So I really saw the opportunity to capitalize on the educational piece. And that's why at the end of, I kept the episodes short. They're only about 30 minutes an episode, but I said I'm going to be doing a season 2. I'm not sure when I'm going to have that done, but I want to expand on those concepts. I want to expand more into what the laws say and current whistleblower protection laws in Canada and how they're deficient. So that's what I plan to do next. But this one is all about my story with those little sidebar conversations snuck in.
Well, so here's the thing. First of all, anyone who's listening to this podcast, please listen to her podcast. Maybe listen to it a couple of times, because even like what I like about how you write and how you speak and whatever it is you're doing is it's almost like you are annotating the what should be or what the myth is versus what's happening. So you might think, oh, the chief of police is doing X, Y, and Z. Sidebar, you should know the chief of police was this and this and this and this. And it's like, oh, I see the conflict. Whereas, some people just will say, oh, there's a conflict of interest. And you're like, okay, where's the like, I don't get it. Where is it? And then you never come back to it. But you've got everything annotated in your head, in your book, in your reports, the whistleblower podcast. I think this is a tool. In fact, in addition to your written work, this podcast, I hope, is something that's already being used in criminology classes. You know how some there's like colleges and institutes that do policing essentials, or like it's called different things, or in university, criminology students study all different aspects of law and law enforcement. I hope they're using this, because what a valuable tool that you can access it anyway in
Yeah.
writing, audio books, and podcasts. I mean, that's how we're consuming content.
Well, the ironic thing, I didn't mention this to you, is Dr. Kwan, who is a professor of criminology. She was at the event where I heard you speak at Ryerson. And she approached me after and said, I really want to connect with you. I think your story has value in my program and in my teachings. And tomorrow I'm going to be going as a guest lecturer into her criminology class. And the topic that they're talking about is oversight in policing, but specifically oversight of police chiefs. So I know I'm going to have a lot of things to share with them that, might open their eyes to some things they might already know based on their research. But it's going to be very interesting because they're the next generation of our lawmakers, right? And maybe lawyers, like whatever field they choose to work in, but they're going to have this level of awareness that maybe previous classes wouldn't have had, because we only really know police oversight when it comes to theory, right? There aren't many cases where we actually get to see the oversight at play, because for the most part, someone like me makes an allegation against a police chief, then they get slid the legal agreement, right? Sign on the dotted line, take the check, shut up, and go away. And we
Yes.
never get to find out what happened, right? So you think, well, what happened? Where's that guy now? And that's why with my case, like, it's never been about money. It's about people knowing what's going on. And, for me to have had a civil lawsuit that goes all the way to the Court of Appeal, it was stayed last year. So it hasn't been dismissed, it's just been stayed. But that police chief is now a deputy commissioner at the RCMP. He just keeps moving up and up and up and up. Like, at what point, I'm going to have to be heard sometime, right? That's kind of my mission now, is just to try to be heard. I mean, I live in Canada. We're supposed to have this accessible justice system. I want to be heard. And I don't know how long that's going to take to happen. And maybe he'll be retired by then. But, it's just incredible to see what actually goes on in these types of instances, right? How few people are willing to listen, and how there really is no accountability.
After all the research I've done, I shouldn't be surprised by the things I hear. But your story is so convoluted with a million things in it that, like, how does one navigate that? Honest to goodness,
Yeah.
and I'm a lawyer.
Well, and at
Where's
this
the
point,
access
like,
to justice?
I have still been looking for lawyers to help me with my case, but at this point, it's like I know it better than anyone ever could, right? I've lived it. I know the ins and outs of every aspect of this case. I don't like the stress that it puts on me to have to represent myself, but I've found it very challenging to find a lawyer that at this stage wants to jump in and help me, just because it's so convoluted, which I think was also part of their strategy, right? Make it so convoluted that no one's going to know what's going on anymore, and maybe I'll just go away.
Well, Kelly, I don't know. I can't thank you enough, because I actually follow your stuff. I listen to your podcast, but every time I hear you, I learn something else, and I'm just enraged by what, and this too. It's just like a multitude of things, one on top of another, and the fact that they're trying to really oppress a Native woman also makes me very, very angry, because the system has oppressed Native women enough. But you have just shown how hardcore Native women can be, and that you just don't give up. And I feel so honored to know you. I'm so thankful for the time that you took here. And I do want you to do the audiobook for the longer one. And I do want a season 2 to this podcast because the rest of the world needs to know. I can only research so much from the outside, right? I get
Right.
either publicly available information or I have to do access to information requests or from reports and commissions. I'm not on the inside of Waterloo policing or Toronto policing or Durham region or like any of the policing across the country. I'm not on the inside. It's people like you who are gold. You pay the biggest price, but we wouldn't know but for you. And I'm so thankful for you for all of that you're doing. And I wanted to call out to people, if you go to her website, it's called policeversuswhistleblower.ca. You can get lots of information. You can buy her books and things. But if you want to support, like, you can support Kelly in a multitude of ways. You can, buy any of her books or her ebooks, her audiobooks. I'm sure you could offer payment for her to come as a public speaker and help educate about these things. I believe there is. Do you still have a donation button to help with all of the litigation and things like that?
Yeah, I do. And I hope that your listeners understand that, I decided to put that up there because last year after, we were entering our fifth year of all this, but at the Court of Appeal, it was very strange, but they denied my appeal. They said, like, appeal denied, but we're not really going to deny your appeal because we're not going to dismiss your lawsuit. We're going to stay it. So it's going to be put on hold. And then I had to incur a $15,000 cost award. These are the kinds of things that have happened to me along the way that, even though I'm not having to pay a lawyer, like, this is the problem with access to justice in Canada, right? I've chosen to do this myself because I can't afford a lawyer, but along the way, I still have these costs that I've had to incur. So I only put that up there for people who might understand that and
Mhm.
still want to see me fight, because every fight I
Mhm.
decide to take has a cost implication, as you know. So that's been the hard part along the way, is just knowing that
Mhm.
I'm going to try my best and I might lose for reasons out of my control. And if I do, that's to a cost to me personally. So that's why that is up there. But,
Mhm.
buying a book is just as good because I still make a bit of money from that. And if they buy it from me, I can personalize it before I put it in the mail as well. And of course, I
And
appreciate any support. I mean, the biggest reason for me doing the website, as you said, was to educate people, but to get them interested in my case. And every time I have a hearing that's open to the public, that's where I encourage, my supporters to observe these hearings. Because when you sit there and you see what your taxpayer dollars are paying for, it's like, that's the real eye opener, is just to see what actually goes on in these hearings and then realize, like, why are we even doing this? What is all of this for? They are persistently fighting. It's almost when I'm in court, in the back of my head, I almost just hear cha-ching, 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 because I
oh,
know there's never just one lawyer either, right? There's always two, three, four. They bring as many as they want, but it's all on the taxpayer dime, and it just drives me nuts.
well, and that's the thing. So we have a wide range of listeners. So there's a multitude of ways people can help based on their own abilities. So some people, if you can share this podcast, share Kelly's podcast, follow her on Twitter, share the information, that's a free way to help. Going to court and attending or observing when you can, that's a free way to help. For those who have some finances, buying books and audiobooks, that's a way to help. For those who, some people, they don't have the ability to do anything publicly because of the position that they're in, they just want to donate. So that's why we always ask at the end of this podcast, how can we help? Because this whole podcast is about education for action purposes, not for awareness. I don't want someone to be aware of what's happening to you. I want someone to know for the purposes of, okay, let's rally the troops. Let's figure out how we can help. And I hope that my podcast and the YouTube and every piece of this that I can try to promote around the world, that helps somewhat. Kelly, I hope we stay in touch, because I'm going to keep following what's happening to you. But you can never assume that everything is in the media or public, so the fact that you keep putting it on your social media is really helpful to people like us who want to follow along. And thank you again, and stay strong. I hope you and your family are okay.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for amplifying my voice, Pam. I mean, without people like you that have the platform you have, taking my message and amplifying it, I mean, I'm just one little person in Ontario, and we're losing our media, right? We're losing independent media. It's getting harder and harder to get people to cover cases like mine. So I sincerely appreciate the chance that you've given me to amplify my voice across Canada.
Well, stay strong, my friend, and we will probably have you back soon for the inevitable update. And I just know at some point it's going to be victory.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to all the Warrior Life podcast listeners for tuning into my show. I'll make sure, as always, to post links in the description box where you can buy Kelly's books and where you can listen to her podcast. And if you liked this episode, please consider supporting my podcast by subscribing to it, liking it, sharing nice comments, and even giving good reviews. If you want more information about any of the issues that we talk about on this podcast, make sure to check out my website, pampalmater.com. Till next time, keep living a warrior life. Walalia. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting my podcast. Your donations help me keep the Warrior Life podcast open access to everyone and free from those annoying ads. And it's super simple. Just click on the link below to sign up for a Patreon monthly or yearly subscription, or click the links for the Buy Me a Coffee app or the Ko-fi app to make one-time contributions. And if you belong to an awesome community group, business, or organization that's committed to Indigenous reconciliation, consider sponsoring an episode or two, or as many as you like. Thank you for helping me lift the voices of Indigenous warriors doing phenomenal things to help make our world a better place.